everyone. Thanks for
Yeah.
joining today. My
Good
name
morning.
is Carla Reyes. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the head of business development at Code Coven, which is a global classroom and accelerator for underrepresented game developers. And I'm joined by the fantastic Kelly Wallach today. I'll let Kelly introduce herself, but just want to give an overview of what we're going to be discussing today, which is navigating fundraising in a post-pandemic world. So really just trying to make sense of everything that's happening in the economy and society right now, and trying to share some insight and advice to you all as indie game developers who are looking to pitch, publish, and gain investment for your games. So Kelly?
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. I've always loved talking about this topic, so this is a great one for me. So my name's Kelly Wallach, she, her. I'll give a little background on myself. I've been in the games industry for a little over a decade. For most of that time, I had founded and ran a company called the Indie Mega Booth, which was a showcase for independent game developers. We worked with over 800 studios during the nearly decade that we were running. Mostly did consumer or showcases at consumer facing events, but we did things at like GDC. We co-organized Bit Summit, which is in Kyoto. We did events like globally all over the world. Sadly, we had to go into hibernation during the pandemic, but TBD. So hopefully I'll have some more to say about that soon. And then for the last 7 years, I was also the chairperson for the Independent Games Festival, which is an award ceremony for independent game developers. Just stepped down from that position this past year. I think I was the longest running tenure of a chairperson and also the first woman to hold the title, which is really exciting. And then about 4 years or so ago, I had gotten approached by Ed Freeze, who he was a long time at Microsoft, helped launch the original Xbox and Xbox project, and was heading up their publishing department for a long time. And he had wanted to start a venture fund, but really wanted to have this community component to it. So when we were talking about it, sorry, it's a little early for me, so this is the first thing I'm saying. So when we were talking about it, we had a lot of shared values around like what we wanted to do with the community side, how we felt about the games industry. We have a really big focus on diversity. And so like I said, I didn't know too much about venture funding at the time, but I really loved the idea of working with Ed and building this community. So for the last couple of years, I've been also building and running the community of the One Up Fund. And then earlier this year came on as a full-time partner, meaning that I'm involved in the investing decisions, taking pitch meetings, and then also starting to be involved in the fundraising process. So that's I have a lot of jobs. There's like 9 other things I haven't mentioned that I also do, but that's kind of primarily, what my role has been in the industry. So it's been very focused on indie developers, small teams, supporting developers, helping them get connected up with platform holders, publishers, investors, funders. My kind of motto is I want more weird people making weird things, but it could also be cool people making cool things, I guess, if you don't like the word weird, but I'm a bit of a fan of weird. So that's kind of the goal in the industry.
I am as well. I think we're all wonderfully weird in this industry. And thank you so much for sharing that. And it's why I'm very excited to pick your brain today, because I think you have just such a vast and holistic insight into different facets of the broader games industry, but also particularly within the indie game development scene. And so what I'd like to start talking about first is just kind of the foundations of fundraising and some tips and insight into how indies can get started on navigating that process. And then we can move into discussing some market trends and really honing in on sort of the title of this talk, right, in terms of making sense in where we are now in 2022 in a post-pandemic world. But the first question I have is really just in terms of getting started, like how can indie developers determine readiness for pitching, publishing, or seeking investment? There will be different perspectives around what is essential in a developer's toolkit. Do they need a prototype? Are they okay with just an idea? Some VCs and investors are simply investing in founders now based on a profile, right? So what's your take on that?
Yeah, again, I think it kind of depends on how and where you're trying to pitch and fundraise. So I'll talk a little bit about publishing and then, or project financing, I guess might be a better way to say, and then I'll talk a little bit about investment funding as well. So I think that, if you're going to go after publishing funding, you might need something more than just kind of like an idea and a team. I think this also kind of depends on your experience in the industry. So if you're like relatively new in the industry and you haven't shipped a lot of titles before, you haven't run a studio before, I think that there might be a little bit more things that you need to like go along. Like any of the pitches that I've really seen that have, from an investment standpoint, that have gotten funding kind of like on an idea and a dream, are like teams that are like, I have 20 years in the games industry and I've run 2 studios before, or I've worked on these like huge titles and I was very high up in the company that I was at. And I have this team of like, people who also have experience in this field as well too. So it's a little less like kind of pie in the sky, because I think that there's an understanding that the people that are pitching the idea can likely execute on what they're trying to do. I think also too that the kind of like the idea and the dream can work a little better, sounds counterintuitive, on like a giant title, because it's really hard to be like, I'm going to put together a prototype for a $50 million game before I go and pitch, because that's just like a huge process, right?
Yeah.
But then like something in the mobile space, you can kind of pitch on the dream and, potentially get funding somehow, through a publisher or traditional investment. But because there's so much rapid iteration, mobile market is very metrics driven. It's like you kind of want to make product quicker and you want to be testing it and getting it into soft launch markets. Mobile is an area that I'm getting more involved in now. It's because it's not super prevalent in the indie scene for a lot of like, I guess, obvious and not so obvious reasons. But so I think if you're focusing on mobile, you might need something sooner rather than later, even something that's like very, very just initially playable or has like some very initial metrics. I've seen some investors now wanting more initial metrics, just because of the way the market's shifted and stuff, even with games that are kind of like early in production. But like I mentioned, I think that having a prototype for like a gigantic project is going to be pretty complicated. Having a prototype for a mobile project would make sense. I think for like an indie scope thing, which is something that we're talking about here, you probably could have some sort of small playable or prototype or a vertical slice. I don't know how necessary it would be. I think it would kind of depend again on the scope and scale of the project, on the experience of the team. If you're really new to the industry and you've put together something that's like playable, that's like really cool, the art style is amazing, or the mechanic is super interesting, or something like that, like you might have a better chance of somebody wanting to fund it rather than just saying like, hey, I just got out of school and I have an idea, I'd like some money, because at that point there's so much unproven that it's a little hard to, like, I think from a funding standpoint, to tell whether that's worth putting in the money to. That being said, I think that there's a lot of programs, like I know Sony and Microsoft have like little grant programs, so does Epic. There's lots of ways for like small new indie teams to like get some small amount of like prototype funding, to be able to get to that point so that they can get something ready to go talk to like publishers and platform holders and investors if they choose to do that.
That's actually a good segue into the next question I had, which is around how developers should evaluate the current state of their project or studio, in order to determine which type of funding they should pursue. So you mentioned grants, and I guess if you're at a sort of pre-production stage, or just in the concept phase, and that could be a viable route. That's certainly what we've been doing at Code Coven through the accelerators that we've been running. A lot of the developers that we've been including in our accelerators don't necessarily have a playable demo or prototype, but we still provide them with funding, and then we get them to the next stage at which they can go through the accelerator and develop that prototype then. But what is the criteria that developers should be considering when they're determining what kind of funding they should be seeking?
Yeah, so I talked about this recently, and I've actually had 2 podcasts go out recently. That one where I talk a lot about the OneUp community and investing and stuff, and then another one that was kind of like a primer on how equity investing works. So if you kind of want to deeper dive into any of this stuff, that could be a good place to learn a little bit more. But one of the things that we talked about, and I think it's interesting is that I think it's less about the project and more about like, what do you want as a studio, right? So there are like I feel like any project could be right for any amount of funding, kind of depending, or any type of funding, depending on like what you really want to do with it. So this is something that totally blew my mind about investment funding, and or equity investment, and I didn't realize this, but like investors don't make any money until you sell your company. So like you can make a game that makes like $1 billion, and like 99% of the time, I'm sure there's, exceptions to how these are set up. Like your investors are getting none of that money. Like that money is just going back into the company. It's going into profit sharing for the team and the founders. And so like basically if you plan to like grow a studio, grow a company till it's like large and then sell it, that dream and that idea, that's perfect for equity investment. There's what's considered a lifestyle company, which the Mega Boost was that. So this is like not a derogatory thing, but it basically means that like the point is that you're making enough money to like kind of keep going, right? So a lot of indie studios would be considered like a lifestyle company, where the goal is to like keep making games with the people that you love working with, and then just like get enough money to make the next game, right? I'm sure there is also the dream of like, oh, I'm Stardew Valley now, right? Like I've hit it big, and at that point you could just like do whatever you want, right? But not everyone, that's exciting because it's very rare, right? So if your goal is to kind of like build a studio and a company that's making cool things, and little projects, and you put them out, and like you can just keep making the next game, maybe you kind of hit it big with something like that, might be better for project financing or for other forms of fundraising than equity investment, because an investor is going to look at like how big can this company get, and are they going to sell it at the end. So I don't think that there's a right or wrong answer to those things, but I do think that like that to me is the differentiation, and not so much the project. I mean, the project can go along with that, right? So if you're like, hey, I'm going to make small little vignette games over a period of time or something, like, okay, that might be hard to like pitch to an equity investor. But I think that there's a variety of things that you could pitch to investors that in theory could like grow and make your company really big, even having a portfolio of games, right? So it's not like you have to make one giant expensive, exciting AAA title. You could be like, hey, we're going to like make like 10 of these games over the course of however many years, and we're going to grow this audience. And then like by the time we get to our 5th or 6th game, it's going to be really big, and that's going to be exciting. So I think that there's a lot of variety of ways to do that. But I would think a lot more about like, what do you want as a studio, and what do you want as a founder, and what are your ambitions and what are your goals around it, and then find the funding that would support that properly, as opposed to like thinking about it as like, is this the right project?
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks for sharing that. And irrespective of the type of funding that a developer might go after, is there any standardized criteria that you've seen now? Within having worn multiple hats within the indie game ecosystem,
Yeah.
like what are some of the more salient and common themes that you see, across people evaluating, whether it's through a grants program or angel investing even, right? Or equity investment, up until equity investment. So what are the key, components of that perfect pitch or,
Yeah, and so this is something that I think that this works whether you're whatever kind of investing you're doing or whatever kind of studio you're trying to build. I am a huge fan of like vision boarding and like planning out like what are you working towards? I think a lot of people have like a fuzzy idea, but they're not totally sure what exactly they're going for. And so I think most of the pitches that I've seen be the most successful are ones where it's very clear that the person has thought very deeply about what they're trying to build and why they're trying to build it and what exactly it's going to take to build that. And so, in my experience, when you're getting asked questions during a pitch meeting or during an evaluation for an accelerator or something, I think it's less about like, do you have a right answer? And more like, do you have an answer, and has that answer been thought through? So if you're asking for $20 million, like that's a lot of money, and it's fine to ask for $20 million. And there are definitely games that cost $20 million, but like, why do you need $20 million, right? And like, what exactly is that $20 million going to be used for? And I'm not talking, I mean, I think you should definitely have a spreadsheet that's like exactly what the $20 million is being used for. But if you can justify like, hey, we need this much to hire to get to this point, and this much, and this point, and this point, I think that like goes a really long way. And on the flip side, which I see more with indie developers, is I think that they're really underestimating what it actually takes to make and create a game, right? I'm a huge proponent for a lot of reasons of like making sure that people are compensated for their work and being paid to work on things. And so if you really want to be realistic about being able to pay your team properly and to be able to hire the resources that you need, like most indie games, I think, I haven't done a back of the envelope calculation lately, but I'd say they're probably in like the $500,000 to $1 million range or more, which sounds like a lot. And I think that if a lot of teams sat down and they were like, oh, it's going to cost $100,000 or $200,000, because they're not taking into consideration like their time, like a lot of people and founders aren't paying themselves. They might be like, oh, well, I'll do some agreements on rev share, which again, it's fine, however you want to set things up. But I think too, if you go and you pitch to somebody like a publisher or a platform holder or an investor, and you're like, I need $72,000.50 to like make this game, and like, I'm going to like not pay rent. And then this person like agreed that they would do it on the side. I think that also is like a red flag for somebody to invest in the project, because again, it's almost kind of on the other side of what I meant, like, asking for $50 million or something, is that, it kind of shows that you're not connecting the dots on like the reality of what you actually need to finish the project, and the proper amount of resources and time that it's really going to take to make something like that. Because say it does cost you $70,000, but maybe it takes you 8 years to make it, because everybody's only working on it for 10 minutes a day or something, like that's another thing. Like, somebody who's funding a project, because when it comes down to it, the point of all of the funding from the perspective of the funders, 99% of the time is to like, they hope that it makes some money, right? Or that they hope that you make money, or they hope that like it becomes successful, or, and there's a lot of projects that are just for like, less in the US, but things like art grants and, people that are kind of like patron of the arts style things, and stuff that's like to build goodwill or to help to bring, diversity into the industry. And so those are less about like, how much money is it making? But like, generally that's what the perspective of like a publisher or investor is going to be, is like, will this make money in the end? And so I think that if you've really thought through what you're trying to make, what you're trying to build with your studio, what that timeline might be, what your resources might be, also being self-aware of where your gaps are. I actually think it's a really good thing to say the things that you don't have, because it also shows that you have awareness of the potential pitfalls. So I think the more that you can think about that, and the more you can go in and just present a holistic picture that is very real of what you need, I think that that's where I see the most successful projects, because I think that also kind of eliminates the problem where you're pitching a game that's not interesting or something that's been done a million times. Because if you're also doing a little bit of like a market analysis, or you're kind of thinking about like, what is the audience, you might be like, oh, there's 9 million of this genre of game already, so like maybe I should like put a twist on it, or maybe I should make it a little different, or I should do that. So I think it kind of solves a lot of the problems that people have when they go into pitch, if they just spend a lot of time up front being very clear about like what they need and what they're looking for. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. There's definitely one point in there that I'd like to echo, which is, around making sure that you're compensating yourself as an indie developer,
yes.
and your team. It's certainly something that we factor, into our grant distributions and stipend distributions within our accelerators at Code Coven. We specifically fundraise to be able to distribute stipends to the devs that are going through the accelerator, but also want to see how they are budgeting and make sure that they are paying their teams, and compensating them for their time, because suddenly all those resources get used up and you don't realize it. So definitely workshopping through budgeting is something that I think
and I will caveat this with saying I'm giving this advice as someone who barely paid themselves for the first handful of years. And I'm only saying it with the retrospective of like, there are a lot of things, like it can build up resentment, along with like the rest, if you're paying the rest of your team, but you're not really paying yourself, it kind of creates this like, almost like kind of like a martyr feeling situation, which isn't super great. It also made me feel really unstable and unsafe. And I think that like the couple of years leading into the pandemic, I had started to pay myself more regularly, and then had slowly upped it to kind of like what would be considered like an entry level salary in the area that I live. And I was able to save money. And this is not to say that I was like financially suffering the whole time. I was doing my thing, and I was doing the things that I wanted to do, and I had a good time with it. But I was able to create a savings, which I hadn't had in a long time. And then when the pandemic happened and I had to close the company, I was able to like, it wasn't a disaster. I mean, it was a disaster, but it wasn't, like I wasn't stuck with nothing basically at the end of it, because it was this huge unforeseen thing that like I wasn't expecting or planning for. But because I had gotten in the habit of paying myself and was able to have, some sort of like cushion for myself, then it made that transition a lot easier. And so I just, you never know what's going to happen. And I think that like making sure it's the oxygen mask, put the oxygen mask on yourself kind of thing, making sure that you're taken care of, I think will also put you in a better mindset to be able to run the company effectively, right? Because you're not always in this kind of like fight or flight mode. And this is like much easier said than done kind of situation, like there is money and things out there, but it can also feel like there's a lot of scarcity around it, and like you might be scrapping together a bunch of stuff and your runway is really short, and how are you making the bills this month and next month, and like that pressure, and paying your team and all that was such an emotional weight and component to running a business that I didn't understand when I first started, that I just think is like really important to consider when you're getting into it. And the more that you can help to make sure that you're taken care of, I think the better that you can do with making those kinds of decisions.
Definitely. That makes a lot of sense. I want to talk also a little bit about the market analysis that you mentioned. You also talked about metrics earlier, right? And
Yeah.
how developers should be including some of those. But in the absence of data or the infrastructure to have robust, analytics, especially if you're just at an early prototype
Yeah.
stage with indies. But I mean, you do mention mobile, and we are seeing a lot of a lot more indies start developing for mobile. I'm a mentor for the Google Indie Games Accelerator, which is like
Oh, great.
primarily focused on
Yeah.
mobile development. It's been really cool to see, because especially there's so much opportunity within emerging markets for mobile game
Yes.
development.
Yeah.
But let's say you're just an indie dev, not necessarily developing for mobile. Like where can you start? And are basic like qualitative feedback insights valid in a pitch? Right? Like what sort of data would you be looking for as an investor?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I don't have a huge depth of knowledge on the mobile stuff, so I'm going to speak kind of generically about what I've seen. I think, well, first off, this was something that was kind of new for me too, is that there's a handful of companies that do data and analytics and market research and stuff for the games industry. I'd say the most popular ones are Newzoo, which is mostly focused on PC and console, and they have a little bit of mobile data, and then Sensor Tower, which is focused primarily on mobile data. To gain access, like to get a license to actually use those, are very, very expensive, especially for a small studio. So you're talking like tens of thousands of dollars kind of cost per year. But they do actually put out a ton of free reports and free resources. If you sign up for like newsletters and things that they send, they're always like, hey, here's a report, that we did on this market or something. So I would really highly recommend checking out those kinds of sites and finding just free data. And I've seen in pitches lots of times stuff that's just pulled from, like annual reports or something that are free that are put out by Newzoo and Sensor Tower. So I think as long as it's like coming from a reputable source, I think that that's fine to use that. As far as like what the benchmarks are for good metrics in mobile, like I said, I feel like there's like, all these retention numbers, there's stuff on ad spend, it's almost like a separate language, I feel like, from the rest of the games industry. So my kind of advice would be to like try and find some other people who are doing work in mobile, or look at some stuff online and see if you can find any kind of good benchmark numbers on like what you would hope that your game would have. But there's so many different ways to get those numbers. Like you could do like a friends and family testing. You could do a soft launch in like a market that's not in the US. And everybody has differing opinions on whether these are good or not. Because, sometimes if you're paying for a company to acquire users, they'll like kind of bump up how good the numbers sound because they want you to hire them later. And if it's like all your friends who like love you and love your game, then like those numbers are obviously going to be higher. So, I think that that's like kind of its own little like sciencey thing,
Oh yes.
within the games industry. As far as like metrics, I'd say for other games, Yeah, if it's very early and it's like a kind of more traditional like PC console game, or it's like a larger scope or it's going to take a few years to build, I don't think most people at the beginning are going to expect any kind of like real numbers. But I think that once you get a little further along, like once you get into an alpha, if you can get a couple hundred people playing it, or a few thousand people, or something, just something to kind of get some like initial idea and feedback, I do think that that's important just regardless. And that was kind of one of the functions that I think showcasing your game at a physical event was really good for, was to get a lot of rapid play testing from like a wide variety of people who also were interested in video games and might be your potential audience. And so that you could also like see, what people were getting excited about. There could be some false positives in there. Like something that was very common was that local multiplayer games would do really well on show floors, but not super well in sales, because it's like you're in this specific environment where you're like already hanging out with your friends and everyone's having fun and there's a crowd of people watching. And then like when you're at home, like that's a whole different situation, right? And also like for a local multiplayer game, only one person needs to buy a copy of the game. So you're already kind of like cutting your potential profits into half or quarters or whatever it is. So, I think that those numbers as you're in like kind of PC console and you're further along start to get more important. I feel like I am seeing a little bit more of like a trend towards wanting some sort of metrics for PC console, where I think that was kind of just the domain of big AAA companies, and not even that much, which I always thought was kind of funny, because it's like we have access to all this information and data and analytics, and I come from a science background, so I'm like, why are we not using it more? But it's been kind of primarily used, I'd say, in the mobile market, which can be very like cutthroat about it, very like A/B testing and like where does the character look this way or do they look this way, and which one, it's like
you're
super narrowed down.
You're tugging on the heartstrings of my product manager hat, right? Like as a product manager within the mobile game space, outside of the code dev and stuff, it's something I think about on a daily basis as well. You mentioned something really interesting around the rapid play testing, and I'm curious to know how you've seen developers actually capturing and collecting data during those processes, like if they are, right, like when they're there on the show floor in the conferences watching people play test, are they distributing surveys to play testers during that? I mean, I've been there at conferences playing, but I never feel like I'm actually getting asked, or that the devs are eliciting feedback then and there necessarily. So I'm curious to know what you've seen.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure some people have done surveys. I haven't seen it super common, or to me, I don't think it's super common. I think what's more common is that you put and technically, I don't know, whatever, you hook up analytics into your game, so that like when people are playing it, then you're collecting all that data, like how long are they here, like where are they getting stuck, like how many people picked it up and then just stopped playing it. So I think a lot of it's kind of like a little bit hidden. Also, I think for playtesting, and kind of a good practice thing is, it's not super great for the developer or the designer to be the person that's like interacting with the playtesters, because the playtesters will like be nice to you because they know that you made the game, and they don't want to say something mean or like, and this is also something that we thought about a lot when we were curating for games, whether they were going to be in like our GDC showcase or in a PAX showcase, for example. So GDC, your audience there is other game developers, right? And like when you're at something like PAX, your primary audience is a general consumer or consumers of video games. And so if we saw a game that we felt had a lot of potential but needed like key feedback, we would put it at GDC, because the kind of feedback that you're going to get from another developer or designer might be like, oh, if you change the controls here, or if you change this loop, or if you did this, like they can kind of identify from like a design and technical standpoint what you might need to do with the game to help improve something, where like a general user or general consumer playtesting might just be like, oh, I felt stuck, or I felt mad, or like it didn't jump right, and so like their feedback is going to be a little more like up for interpretation, or you kind of have to figure out like, why are they feeling stuck on this, as opposed to like them being able to kind of like help problem solve, like what you might be looking at. So I'd say that like, keeping all of those things in mind. And also, I think it can be helpful to just see the excitement level. Like, are people talking to their friends about it? Are they bringing people back? Are they like, oh my God, the art is so cool? I had an anecdote from Alex Bruce, who had made Antichamber, and like he always had a hard time explaining what the game was, and like somebody just walked by and was like, oh, it's like MC Escher the video game, And he was like, oh, perfect, great, right? Because like if you take a person who doesn't know what this is at all, they have no vested interest in coming up with a good explanation for it, and they just can like offhand like they can look at it in a way that like you're not going to be able to look at it, or your friends might not be able to look at it. So I think you can also get some kind of insight on to help with like some like marketing, or like what is like standing out from your game. Because going into it, you might have been like, oh, everyone's going to really love the combat, but everyone's like, man, I love this character, or like I really like this thing. So then you can be like, okay, I'm going to double down on that. And I think that that's like what the mobile and the rapid iteration is doing, is that mobile tends almost to be like community driven in a way. And I think that some game studios do this really well too, where they're like getting a lot of people in really early and all the time to get feedback from their fans and from the community and from an audience on like what is resonating with them, you know? So I think that that can be powerful, but also like, I don't know if you've ever seen the like designing a stop sign by committee YouTube video.
Yeah.
You could end up with a stop sign that nobody can read, because 90
Yeah.
people have made a decision about it. You know, so you do have to have your curatorial like eye, you know, on it.
Absolutely. No, I
Yeah,
mean, I think it's super valuable, and especially caveating and being mindful of the potential biases that will emerge, right?
yeah,
And thinking about whom your target audience is, and recruitment for specific playtesting
yeah,
sessions. Community management, is really essential too. As you said,
yeah,
we're seeing more and more studios just create Discord servers immediately so that they can
mhm,
actually go in there and host playtest sessions. Like through
yeah,
our accelerators at Code Coven, we host bi-weekly and even weekly sometimes play testing sessions, not just within the developer community and the cohort, but also to the broader Code Coven community. So
yeah,
it's cool because you'll get the perspectives of both the devs and the consumer in that way
yeah,
as well.
yeah,
So that's really interesting.
yeah,
I also want to ask you a little bit about monetization models, right? Because we're talking about mobile, and mobile are typically a lot now are free to play, or just
yeah,
live service games. And as an indie game developer in this world, in this day and age, when we're
yeah,
seeing an increasing shift toward games as a service, and all of the emotional weight that comes with that for some indies, right? We want to
yeah,
stick to the artistic integrity of the premium title, and that monetization model does have some negative connotations and associations within specific
yeah.
communities. So curious to know like your insight and advice into how developers should be determining what the right monetization model is for their project.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm kind of maybe individually just a fan of like whatever you think is best for your game. Like honestly, I think that there's a balance between pitching and creating something that you think will get funded, and also like having just a very clear straightforward vision about like what you want to do and what you're creating, right? And so I think that you're going to get a million different pieces of advice. I'm sure there's people out there that are like, every single thing that I said, they're like, well, here's the counter argument, and that's fine, but everyone's going to have opinions. And so like, for example, I'll take something like Web3 crypto NFT stuff. There were like, a lot of people that were pro Web3, a lot of people that were anti Web3, a lot of people that were, agnostic about it and just were like, whatever, if you want to add in your game, it's fine. If you don't, go for it. And so I think in a certain situation, or in some situations, you just need to make a decision and stick with it, right? Like if you feel super strongly that like this is a premium game, like pitch it as a premium game, make a premium game, do it. Like if you like deeply feel convicted about that, you either have experience with it, other people have experience with it, you just feel like it's the best thing for your game, then I think that there's also something to just going and expecting to get rejected by people that aren't going to go along with it, and that's fine, and just finding the right partner who's going to believe in like what you're trying to build specifically and the way that you want to do this. That being said, I will say that I think that there's a lot, I don't know on the publisher side too much because I haven't been hearing too much about this, but I think that there is a tendency in the equity investment side to not really go into premium games. I think there's some, I don't know if it feels outdated or there's some sort of biasy or something. Me as an individual, like, not super old, but I've been around for a while. And like, I love the idea of just buying a game and just having it, like I don't really want to have monetization loops. I don't really care about, all of these like kind of ways that I could like buy or spend money or something in a game. Like, I'm just kind of like, I'll just pay some money and I have the game and that's fine. But I do think that there is like almost every team that we've been doing some investing work in. It's like if they are premium, they're kind of starting as a premium title, and going into like early access or something, and then shifting to a free to play model, and then games as a service later. There's a really great, I don't know how much they talk about it, but there's a no clip documentary about the Supergiant team around the time that they were building Hades, and like I know that having to put out regular content really took a toll on the team, and like they're a small company, right? And so games as a service is like not easy to do, right? Because but I think that there are like creative, interesting ways that teams are thinking about it. Like, how do they systemize stuff? Or like, okay, maybe instead of like, you know, like there's a brand new story and characters every like 6 months or something, that there's like other smaller things, or, a battle pass style, so I think that there's actually a lot of exploration and ideas that are happening in that space. So, I would kind of encourage folks to think about like, yeah, again, like what could that look like realistically for the size of team that you have, the scope of the project? Is it the best for the game? What is that going to look like? And if you are going to do premium titles, and this is, I guess, maybe more towards equity investing, like, are you going to have multiple titles? Because what happens after you launch the game then? Like, how does it continue to be making money? And I do think that like free to play moving out of mobile and into PC consoles, we're seeing that a lot as well too, and there's just like a lot of different ways that you could monetize on a free to play model. And like when I first started in the games industry was when free to play was kind of first starting, and there was a lot of negativity around it, especially in the indie space. And I think, some of it is warranted, and, but it's also evolved and changed a lot, and it's something that's not going anywhere. And I think it's something now that a lot of like players, especially on mobile, are expecting. Like I tried to show a game to my friend outside of the games industry the other day. And I was like, it's a great game, da, da, da. And so I showed it, she looked it up on her phone, and she's like, oh, I have to pay for it. And I was like, yeah. like you pay, because she's like, oh, I'm used to them being free, right? And then you like, buy something later. So like, and she didn't want to buy it, right? I let her play it on my phone, and then, she could make a decision about it later. But it was just funny where she was just straight up like confused, like, oh, like why is this mobile game have a dollar amount attached to it?
the perception has shifted. Yeah, I mean, I think personally that one of the values that comes from games as a service is this opportunity for developers and their audience to sort of co-create in a sense, right? Because you're really listening to the feedback of your audience and then being able to iterate and improve your game or implement new features accordingly. And I think that that's one of the more compelling facets in my opinion. But like you mentioned something interesting in terms of, sometimes a project might start out as a premium title and then shift into a free to play model. How are you seeing the impact or changes in monetization models with the new, platform subscription services and distribution channels, right? So we have the Xbox Game Pass, PlayStation has their own, Netflix now, is distributing a lot of content on titles that were maybe historically premium and now just based on those, Netflix subscription. So what are you seeing in that ecosystem, and how are you, if you are, at all supporting some of the studios or developers with negotiating those deals?
Yeah, so I'd say this is another area where I have some insight as far as like teams talking with the folks. I don't know kind of long term if it's really played out, like what does this mean for the industry, or are the teams doing well or not well from it? I would say I've generally heard some positive things from developers. I've definitely heard negative things from people in the industry who are really concerned about what it means in the long term as far as like subscription services go. I think that from the kind of limited experience that I've had with people who have gotten those deals is that it seems really helpful in the sense of just getting a minimum guarantee, basically, of money. I think for smaller teams, especially if you can negotiate a deal like that, I feel like do it, because like you basically are getting paid for what you consider that you might have earned if it were available outside of the subscription service. And so I think that there's like, it could be a really, I think, powerful situation to be in where you just know that you're getting a certain amount of money instead of just launching the game out into the ether. I've heard some anecdotal stuff on that they think that it's done better for sales. Again, this is all, I don't really have a ton of information to back this up on. And I'm going to say, if I zoom out a little bit, I think that for the time that I've been in the games industry and talking to people who've been in the games industry for a long time, is there's always something shifting and changing and new and up and coming. And I think when you're an indie developer, a lot of companies and platforms will come to the indie development community to get a lot of content very rapidly. And I think that you should use that to your advantage as much as you can. Like I'm kind of a like get the money, like we're in a capitalist society. Money is resources and power or whatever at this point, whether you agree with it or not. And like, I want to, for me, like I like to try to be as ethical as I can, kind of about, like you don't want to take money from, especially someone who's being predatory or is hurting the industry or something like that. But generally, I just kind of feel like if you feel like you can do something important and impactful with the money, then try and get it, right? And so I think that there's opportunities where like on emerging platforms or emerging business models or big companies that are looking to do something new, the number of times that I had new platforms, new publishers, new whatever come to me to want to get access to the developer community in the mega booth was so high. And it was like every 6 months there's something, right? And they normally have some small budget that they can kind of throw towards just getting in basically kind of cheap content quickly, because it's a lot harder to be like, okay, we're going to fund a $50 million AAA game than it is to say we're going to have a $10 million fund and we're going to pick up 10 games, right? With that amount of money. So, I think if you can negotiate a good deal, just generally, that you feel like isn't predatory, is going to do good for your studio, it hopefully isn't hurting the industry overall, and is some sort of opportunity that will like let you make better decisions in the future or let you continuing to like run your studio or make your studio successful, then I think that like you should try and do what you can with it, right? And so to kind of zoom back in on the subscription services, I think that there was like a lot of money and opportunity from these companies early when they were first starting this. They were, leaning in heavily on indie community and getting folks into that so that they could broaden that to bring in larger games and stuff later. And so if there's still opportunity to do deals like that, then like, I think that could be a good thing. What it means for the long-term health of the industry. Like, again, I like the premium title where you just buy the game and then you just have it. I'm not sure how they're like paying out on metrics and stuff like, so like, are you making a game now for a subscription service or are you making a game, which is like I said, that's kind of the thing is like, if you have an idea and a vision, then I think you should make the idea and the vision, right?
Yeah.
Like as much as you can. It's hard. There's a lot to balance, when you're like making something that you feel passionate about, that's artistic, that you love, that is creative, but it also needs to be a business, but also you need to pay people, but also you need to take into consideration this ethical thing, but also like, okay, how ethical can I afford to be? It's a lot, and I think you got to just pick where your boundaries and your values lie and try and stick with that just like as much as possible, and make the best of like those opportunities that come to you that like fit within that value system, right?
That really resonates with me. It's something I think about on a daily basis in terms of, we are inherently in a creative industry and we want to maintain that integrity. But at the same time, it's an increasingly competitive market. We're seeing so many dynamic changes in the industry, and we want to follow some of those trends to chase the opportunity. As you say, I'm also a proponent of get the money as long as you know where your values are. If you're doing things ethically, I will, I want you to get supported. I want you to get funded. And that's what we try to do at Code Kevin. But it's a good segue into sort of the market trends section of this talk now, and where I want to focus on where are we today. So during the pandemic, we saw so much change in the industry. There's been a lot of M&A activity, right? Mergers and acquisition activity, job losses across different sectors, but then skyrocketing engagement within the video games industry specifically, right? So like more lucrative opportunities. We saw things like resurgence of social justice movements and more attention to diversity and inclusion. And of course, like the rise of Web3, as you had already alluded to. But now, okay, we are literally about to enter 2023, which is crazy.
Oh my God, I know.
Right?
Can you? I don't know. Like, can you imagine? We started the pandemic in 2020. That's
exactly,
a long
and
time.
Now we're nearly 3 years later, and this is why I put it in quotation marks.
I know, because like, are we ever out of the pandemic?
Because I don't know, and where we are just in terms of the last 6 months. We've felt a very palpable impact on the economy. There have been a lot of layoffs within the games industry as well, despite the increased engagement in video games, but also maybe it has decreased recently due to the return to in-person work and just general like return to normal life. So just curious to know, like, as of today, what are some of the, biggest opportunities and challenges? Are you seeing any dramatic shifts in terms of funding opportunities? Are firms tightening their belts a little bit and more focused on specific things? Like you said, there was a lot of attention to crypto and Web3 based
Yeah.
games previously. Is that still the case now after the crypto winter?
Yeah.
Just curious to know your sort of overarching perspective on this.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. I hate that. I know everyone's so tired to death of the word unprecedented, but I feel like it's unprecedented times. I mean, it is and it isn't, right? Like there's an ebb and flow to things, but also this ebb and flow is like being kind of shadowed by these big, huge macroeconomic things, situations that are just like actually unprecedented in our lifetime, and just generally, that like economies and things haven't had to deal with, like, the rise of globalization and then the breakdown of supply chain things, and, wars and all this stuff that is, and the internet, which wasn't around the last time that there was, like a lot of unprecedented things happening. So I feel like there is like kind of anybody who says that they know what's happening is lying to you. Like if anybody knew what was happening, like I don't know, whatever. They should be picking lottery numbers or something. So but I'm also kind of a like proponent of that there's a lot of opportunity when there's a lot of transition and change, right? Like when things are very settled and very institutionalized, you can carve out a space for yourself, but it is like very hard to do it. Where I think whatever, it's kind of a free for all, like there's a lot of like, that's why I'm kind of like, you could get any game funded, right? If you like are making the right thing at the right time, or pitch it the right way to the right person, or whatever. And so I do think that there's a lot of opportunity when things are shifting and changing. I will say that it feels a little bleak out there in the sense of like fundraising, in equity fundraising. I'd say kind of especially, but then also like the One Up Fund, we're not seeing that. We're having so much deal flow, but then like also, like if your investors have a fund, there's like five levels of investors up, right, that are dumping money down. So if like somebody at the top is spooked about the market because they lost $5 billion or something, right, then like that kind of, this is where trickle down economics actually happens, right?
Yeah.
Is that like, yeah, the scarcity trickles down. I don't think the abundance trickles down so much, but like, so I think that like people, I would say, are kind of getting a little more conservative. And I think it's less because like there's less money or less engagement or less interest, and more because there is like uncertainty. So I work with a financial planner who's a woman who's amazing. And she kind of talks about like when the markets are volatile, it's because there's uncertainty. So things like right before an election, there's a lot of volatility in a market because we don't know what's happening. As soon as the election is over, then there's stability in the markets, because whether it was a good or a bad outcome, there was an outcome. So like now we know what's happened in it, right? So I think that there's just piles and piles and piles of uncertainty, and that's kind of compressing down to a point where people, I think, are just kind of like freezing, and they're just like, okay, I don't know what to do because I thought it was going this way, now it's going this way, and then there's this and this and this and this. Like I said, though, there's still demand for video games, obviously. Like there's still money out there for funding, there's still money out there for projects, but I'd say it is kind of like a more difficult time, even in the mobile market area. Like there's been a lot of like the privacy things and how targeted ads work, and that's really like thrown a giant wrench into like what people have been planning to do on ad spend and UA, which was kind of the backbone of the mobile industry. So if you're a team who can figure out the new model for that, right, then like you're going to be in an amazing position moving forward, because like that's an opportunity, right? But if you're someone like most people who are in the mobile market and are used to a certain kind of like system and structure, like now you have to rethink that, and now you're having to like make all of these difficult decisions and things that like you might not have had to make in the past. As far as like trends and things go, I'm assuming there's still money left in like some of these crypto Web3 funds, because they had a lot of money. I don't know. I'm sure they're still like investing stuff. We were pretty agnostic on it, so it wasn't like a core value of like what we were trying to do. I'd say something that like comes up a lot that I think is really interesting is like the AI component of stuff, and like especially for smaller teams. And I have some friends in the indie scene who are thinking a lot about this, is that it could narrow the gap between like an indie quality game and a AAA quality game, in ways of like concept art or music or writing or so, just basically to like give your pipeline like extra resources essentially without needing the extra financial resources. So I think that that's something that could be really exciting and something that is also probably a short-ish opportunity, because at some point that's all going to merge, and like maybe everyone is using it, and then there's not kind of this advantage of a small team using it versus like a big team using it. But I think it's also like happening very rapidly. Like the number of times that I've heard the word AI in the last like 3 weeks has increased. I
Oh,
feel like
yes.
500%. Everyone I know on Instagram is posting their like
The GPT-4,
or they're like,
GPT-3.
they're like
Yeah.
AI versions of themselves. And like my
Yeah.
friend had also just sent me, like he ran my cartoon profile picture through a bunch of stuff. And I was like, oh, I should post this. And then like 3 days later, like literally everyone on the internet is posting like AI pictures of themselves. So I feel like that's something that is exciting and interesting. And I've heard come up in pitches. To me, it feels a little less, how do I want to say, like trendy than the Web3 stuff did. The Web3 stuff, it was clearly a bubble, that was going to pop at some point. I still think that there's a lot of interesting technology and opportunities and things within, Web3, blockchain, crypto, NFT. Maybe it needs a rebranding, or like people just need to rethink about, like how they're looking at it. But I think AI is something that, I'm hearing come up that's interesting.
I absolutely agree. I've been going down the generative AI rabbit hole the
Yeah.
past few weeks as well, and just seeing the potential for democratizing the game development process,
Yes.
right? In terms
Yeah.
of like you are a small to medium-sized indie, game studio, and
Yeah.
leveraging the power of these tools can really help accelerate your development,
Yeah.
serve as a proxy for some of the resources that you might otherwise not be able to get, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's definitely interesting. As far as other emerging or emergent technologies, and you mentioned that you're kind of agnostic on the Web3 thing at One Up, but what about extended reality, right? VR and
Yeah.
AR. Are you seeing more opportunity within either space right now? There's so much debate and discourse around, okay,
Yeah.
is it the time for VR? Is it not? Is it, I know where
Yeah.
AR stands a little bit, but
Yeah. I have some complicated feelings on it. I feel like there's probably, as far as like a funding perspective goes, and this is, I'm speaking kind of more from an equity investment standpoint. I feel like there's probably more potential in AR than there is in VR. And maybe for a variety of reasons that we don't need to get into right now. I think VR for me is one of those things that it exists in the zeitgeist of people's imaginations of the future, right? Like there is no future where we don't imagine that we're walking around in some holodeck or some immersive world, whether it's on, glasses or not glasses, or a headset or not. So there's something to me that in a very long term, like 50 years, 100 years or something, like VR, AR has just got to happen, because I just can't imagine it not, based on all science fiction and all of human imagination for the last 100 years. Um, that being said, I don't feel like the market is really quite there yet. And again, maybe this is a thing that like if you make I've not seen a lot of really, I'd say, compelling VR games recently, or pitches. We don't really get them a lot, and when we do, I think it's kind of muddled with like kind of trying to chase some opportunity where like you might be able to get some grant or funding money, or they just think it's a neat idea but they're not totally sure what to do with it. So I'm sure that there is like Beat Saber, right? Like I feel like that's like the most popular thing that came through VR so far, and Tilt Brush, I guess, would be the other one. And so I'm like, okay, well, what's the next Beat Saber? And I'm not sure why or what's been going on, that there just hasn't really been this kind of like great use case for like, why is this game a VR game versus just a game, or just a regular game, or that isn't kind of like a, like a quick scare, or like a neat little toy or something like that. So I do think that there's opportunity there. But I will say that I think, as far as like my awareness of like getting funding for something like that, it's mostly coming from platforms or people that are invested in the technology advancing forward, and less because there's like a consumer demand, I guess, and even less that there's a demand in the investment space to get into it. But again, giant asterisk on everything. I think if you had a super compelling team, a super compelling project, a really cool idea, like you could get somewhere with that, right? And that could be, you could be the person who like makes VR the thing that everyone wants to have. And that again, like another facet of that is all of my friends outside of the games industry love VR. Like every, I wouldn't say average person, like every non-games person or something, but like people who are not like really into video games or into the culture of video games, all like want a VR headset, have bought a friend a VR headset, have a VR head. It reminds me of like when like Nintendo and stuff was first coming out. It was just that like everybody had a Nintendo and it was just super cool. And if you didn't have one, everybody went to the friend's house who had one, and when you were there they're like, I have a Nintendo, and you're like, holy moly, you have a Nintendo, and like little gun, so like I feel like VR has that, so it has some sort of like broad mass appeal that I think is being a little bit underestimated, but it's kind of being used in a very casual kind of like party trick kind of
Yeah,
way, like
that's what I was going to ask you about, like if whether
yeah,
they're more like short form experiences. And I think one of the challenges that developers had been facing historically was just the lack of accessibility of the hardware. But now that's
yeah,
becoming, that's changing and we're getting updates. And I
yeah,
think it'll be interesting to see how much more emerges
yeah,
within that space.
yeah,
Just before we leave some time for questions, I do want to ask you about like underserved markets and where you're
yeah,
seeing opportunity, because going back to this whole, there's a cultural moment where there's attention to diversity and inclusion, and we know now that the audience of the gamer audience has ever evolved, right? And it's ever
yeah,
evolving, and it's ballooning and increasing, and so we're not just limited to that 18 to 35-year-old male demographic
yeah,
that we keep hearing and seeing.
I know, it's
So
so
just
outdated.
like, are there any yeah, are there any specific sort of underserved markets that you're particularly excited about, or that you're seeing developers developing for, or that you hope to see developers start addressing in terms of target audience?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I feel so passionately about. I mean, we've touched on it kind of like a little bit throughout some of the questions, but I think the diversity component of teams and of audiences and of games is just so important. And I think it's also like literally the future. Like if you want to talk about an opportunity, like that is an opportunity, right? And there's something that like Ed says a lot, I totally agree with. We're starting to hear it echoed by a lot of founders, is that like the audience of people who play video games needs to be reflected in the studios that are making them, right? So like if you're a mobile game studio and you're making games for women and it's a bunch of guys in their 50s or 40s or whatever, like you don't have anybody who is the audience, your target audience for your game within that, right? And I think that like, besides the fact that like that doesn't feel great, just kind of from a moral, ethical standpoint, I just also think it's like a bad business decision, like I think that there is just so much opportunity in making games for underserved audiences, and underserved audiences at this point can basically mean anything outside of the 18 to 34, white male who's playing first person shooter kind of game. I do think that there is a lot of funding and diversity programs and things with inside of organizations that are really trying to like help to support those kinds of founders. I always wish it's more. I always wish it was more integrated. And I do have a concern, and I'm not quite seeing it yet, but I do have a concern that as the markets are rougher and people are making more traditional bets or conservative bets, that means that
It'll be at
they're
the
only,
expense of,
yeah,
yeah.
exactly. And I think that this might be or is being seen across a lot of different industries. And so I have a hope that like that's not what that means. And I do still see in some cases people who are reflective of their audiences or targeting a non-traditional audience or underserved audience or whatever, I think are still struggling to kind of get the point across to people who are in positions of power to make decisions about who gets funding and who doesn't. And that's like one of the primary reasons why I really wanted to get involved in the funding side of work, is because like there's not too many opportunities for people like me to be in a position to hold that much autonomy and decision making power over who gets money, right? And so I'm like, this is where I can have huge impact. So I think that like there's a lot of different ways that this can be addressed, but like one of the ways that I'm like excited about is uplifting people into decision making positions who are those audiences, who can look at those games, who can see those things, and they can say like, I get this game, I get this audience, I understand who this is for, this does not feel risky to me, this feels like a clear shot, right? And the more we have that, then I think the more that like those audiences can finally get what they deserve. And I think anybody who's making those things and can get it to them is like, they're going to do well. like I said, I think it's a good business decision. Like,
I cannot
like we
thank
can all
you.
make money.
I cannot thank you enough for your advocacy, especially as someone who's on the other end trying to fundraise to support underrepresented game
Yeah.
developers, right? No,
Yeah.
but thank you so much for sharing that insight and everything overall. You really are a trove of knowledge within this space, and I certainly learned a lot, and I hope that
Great.
the audience
Yeah.
did. I'm mindful we have 1 minute, but there is one question I
Okay.
believe in
Let's
the
try and do
chat
it.
that maybe you
I
can
talk very
address.
quickly, so I can try
Okay.
and do it.
Great. So the question is from Alina Likes Cozy. So it says, great talk. With the economic downturn, what can game developers do additionally to improve their fundraising process? Are investors looking and weighing certain criteria higher due to the market?
Yeah, I think a very mini answer to this is I will say I think there's a little bit of a trend on like, do you have some kind of metrics or are you a little further along in the process? I don't think that that's like kind of formalized across everybody. But I will say that again, I think that like being really clear about what you're looking for, what you're trying to create, having like a good niche in the market and a clear idea of how you think it can be successful in the future is something that is always going to work well, like no matter what the situation is. And I would say also to maybe try and take like kind of smaller steps. Maybe we didn't talk too much. And again, on that podcast that I mentioned, I did talk a lot about the process of equity funding, but there are steps between I'm raising $50 million and like I need to get $200,000 to hire a team of people, right? So there's like, and I think that breaking those steps down a bit further and not asking for the full amount up front and knowing that you're going to do multiple raises, I think will really help. Something we didn't kind of touch on where you were talking about, are people tightening their belt and stuff like that? I would try to get at least 18 months of runway as much as you can, and expect any publishing deal, equity deal, anything to take at least 6 months. And it would take like 6 months from like I'm starting to pitch to like things are signed and I have money in the bank, and that's like a kind of average, right? So it could be a little bit longer and it could be a little bit shorter. So I think keeping that in mind too, so that you're not trying to raise while you're in a really kind of like complicated situation or you're running out of runway or something, is going to put you in a better position to negotiate as well too. So that's my like 45-second answer to a very good question. Thank you so much for asking.
I heard something about 40 to 50-year-old men developers. I agree with you 100% that a group of 40 to 50-year-old dudes should make games for the demographic that they know.
Exactly.
That is
100%.
really a no-brainer. You would think it's a no-brainer, but I don't know.
But here we are.
This was such a great talk. I love this. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be invited. Thank you so much.
This was amazing. So next we have some folks from Exola, and they're going to be talking about the marketing best practices to boost your game's launch. That was a mouthful for some reason.
Nice. Good job.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye,
thank you, everyone.
everyone.
Bye.
And thank you so much, Tripwire Presents, for being such an amazing sponsor.